Welcome to the Oldie podcast. This is from our literary lunch featuring guest speakers and kindly sponsored by Noble Caledonia, specialists in worldwide small ship cruising. Our lunches are held monthly. Details and how to book can be found in our magazine and on the website www.theoldie.co.uk.
Hello, ladies and gentlemen, and thank you so much for coming to the Oldie lunch today. My name is Harry Mount, editor of the greatest magazine in the universe, The Oldie. And we are only here thanks to the extreme kindness of our sponsors, Noble Caledonia, who do wonderful cruises on crucially very small ships. I've been on one, it's fantastic. I'm here standing in for the late, great Barry Cryer, who used to do the job as MC at the Oldie lunches. And he was extremely good friends with the late, great Eric Morecambe and Ernie Wise. In fact, he wrote 2 Christmas specials for Morecambe and Wise. And he was a great friend of Joan Morecambe, the widow of Eric Morecambe, who has just died at the age of 97. And Barry had a terrific, his favourite, he didn't just have an Eric Morecambe favourite joke, he had a favourite Joan Morecambe joke. And this was it. It was Eric Morecambe talking about his wife, the late Joan Morecambe. I always take my wife morning tea in my pyjamas. But is she grateful? No, she says she'd rather have it in a cup. Now, ladies and gentlemen, we've got 3 terrific speakers today. And our first is a best-selling author, distinguished historian, Sinclair McKay, the author of Dresden, The Fire and the Darkness, The Secret Life of Bletchley Park, and Bletchley Park Brain Teasers. And his latest book is Meeting Churchill, A Life in 90 Encounters. Ladies and gentlemen, Sinclair McKay.
Thank you very much for that very kind introduction, and thank you for inviting me along today. Where does one start with Churchill, a figure of such stature? Well, Churchill was 5 foot 6 inches tall, I suppose, is the immediate thing. But that was his stature. He was the same height, roughly, as Joseph Stalin and Rishi Sunak. I can't really think of an obvious moral conclusion to draw from that at the moment, except to say that even though Churchill is possibly the most familiar figure in our national landscape, there's still always something about him that can leap up and surprise you, something you just never knew. Now, we're all sitting here in the National Liberal Club, which, of course, Churchill was a member of himself. He would have sat in this very room. He was a member of the National Liberal Club from 1906 to 1924, until he then became an independent Tory, and I suppose his membership ran out at that stage. But he came back here in 1943, at the height of the war, because you'll see downstairs in the hallway, there's a portrait of young Winston, which was hit during the Blitz and then restored. And Churchill was invited here in 1943 for the official unveiling of that restoration. And while he's here, he gave, in retrospect, a rather moving speech about not just the war, but about the land that would come after the war. And he was talking to assembled liberals, himself a Tory, and he was saying, we all now have to pull together to build the nation's future. And he said he wanted to grab hold of as many liberal ideas as he could, that liberals were all part of that conversation, as much as Tories and as much as Labour. And that was the essential, most surprising thing about Churchill, particularly in this day and age, is that he was the opposite of cancel culture. If anyone had mentioned to him the idea of either shutting down debates or deplatforming someone, he would have been absolutely baffled, bewildered, and infuriated. Because Churchill's entire approach through his 90 long, dazzling years was to spot political opponents and then just make an absolute beeline for them, reveling in their ideas, reveling in the huge rows, the incandescent fury of the arguments, but then the warm personal relationships that came after that. In that sense, he's an example to this day and age. I think particularly, first of all, of his friendship with Charlie Chaplin. Now, he first met Charlie Chaplin in Hollywood in 1929 as a slightly spiky first meeting, but not so spiky that Churchill didn't instantly invite Chaplin to come and stay with him at Chartwell, his country home. Now, Churchill, obviously, very much Tory. Charlie Chaplin, somewhere just to the left of Joseph Stalin. You would think, how as an evening between these two going to go? Well, naturally, they fought like ferrets in a sack, politically, over dinner at Chartwell. But Chaplin did have to say this of Churchill: he seems not to bear malice with those who disagree with him. Churchill said of Charlie Chaplin, "You'd make a good Labour MP." Actually, Churchill was wrong. He jolly well would not have made a good Labour MP. Keir Starmer would have had him deselected within seconds. Way too much of a Corbynite. But that's an example that you see across all these friendships that Churchill had right the way across the years, from Rupert Brooke to H.G. Wells, Albert Einstein to Gracie Fields. There's always this, even when there's antipathy, there's always instances of kind of human warmth too. Sidney and Beatrice Webb, whose name's very familiar in this building, of course, but who laid the intellectual foundation stones of the welfare state. Now, you would think, again, Churchill will be making the sign of the crucifix at a pair such as those. And indeed, Beatrice Webb made the sign of the cross at him. She couldn't bear Churchill. She said of him, "He drinks too much, he talks too much, and does no thinking worthy of the name." So what did Churchill do? He invited Beatrice and Sidney Webb for breakfast when he was a Liberal cabinet minister. He was very keen to hear their ideas on setting up a sort of national health service. Now, this was back in 1907, 1908. Very, very revolutionary thinking. Churchill set out an idea that he had picked up from Germany, that perhaps there could be a form of social insurance that even the most people on the lowest incomes could pay towards. And that social insurance would help create this health service. Sidney Webb looked as if he'd been tasered. He was so shocked by the idea. Beatrice Webb choked on her toast. The whole breakfast ended in absolute howling disaster. But David Lloyd George, who was also there, was helpless with laughter at the spectacle. There were also, we see instances in wartime too, of Churchill's ability to reach out to the most unlikely enemies and just draw them deep within his bosom. Charles de Gaulle, very furiously and unhappily in London with the Free French. There was an occasion, Churchill said of de Gaulle, he is selfish, he is arrogant, he believes he is the centre of the world. He is a great man. Opposites obviously attract. There was a very sticky moment in 1941 involving French troops in Syria and Lebanon, and Charles de Gaulle was levitating with fury about, again, being snubbed, being left out. He was invited to 10 Downing Street by Churchill and went into a long meeting with Churchill. Now, officials outside the door could hear, the language, the screaming, the shouting, and then, after about an hour of this, it went very quiet. And the officials outside the door in 10 Downing Street sort of looked at each other as this quietness went on. And then one of them turned to the other and said, "De Gaulle has murdered Churchill." So they burst into the room, only to find de Gaulle and Churchill both sitting there perfectly contented, smoking huge cigars and beaming at one another. This continued, this gives a sense of reaching out across the most unlikely political abysses. Went into the Labour Party too. He made friends with Jenny Lee, who was later the creator of the Open University. She started out absolutely loathing him in 1929, which is a young independent Labour MP, absolute firebrand. Churchill gave her a book called The American Omen. He said, "This will put you right on economics." It was by one of the most rapacious capitalists who ever walked God's good earth, a journalist called Garrett. It was guaranteed to make Jenny Lee just have a heart attack with shock, and it kind of did. She could pirouette with indignation and say, why have you given me this? Just the idea of it made Churchill laugh. But it was him paying tribute to her intellectual kind of opposition. And they bounced across each other across the years. Jenny Lee then married Nye Bevan, the author of the National Health Service, who, again, regarded Churchill as an absolute monster, the monster of the general strike. He also came to know Harold Wilson when Harold Wilson was a young front bencher. Nye Bevan and Harold Wilson walked off the front bench in 1951 when Labour was in government in protest against military spending. And it was Churchill who approached the young Harold Wilson in the smoking room and said, would you please give a message to your wife, Mary? Because I know for us, politics is a rough game. We take these reverses, we understand the roughness of it, but I think it's often very difficult for those who are married to politicians. It's a very rough game for them. So Harold Wilson said, thank you very much, took this message home to Mary Wilson. Mary Wilson listened to it and burst into inconsolable tears. It was found extraordinarily moving that Winston Churchill should have done such a thing. So Harold Wilson went back the next day to Parliament and went up to Churchill in the smoking room and told him how Mary Wilson, his wife, had responded, at which point Churchill burst into helpless tears. At which point Harold Wilson burst into helpless tears. So that's kind of what you want, really, isn't it? Is that everyone just agreeing over huge, racking sobs. It also, his openness to crying was also particularly famous among his social set. Again, during the war, 1941, he was staying with Lady Diana Cooper and Duff Cooper, and they had arranged a film show for the Saturday night. So Churchill, like everyone else, absolutely adored cinema. And the lineup that they had, as Diana Cooper said, was one very quiet, romantic comedy, a couple of public information films, and a Donald Duck cartoon. She said, Churchill managed to cry through all of them, including the Donald Duck cartoon. And so, yes, so the essence of it, the essence of that life across 90 years, which spanned Disraeli through to the Rolling Stones, with so many kind of extraordinary people in between. This essence of binding people close to his bosom, apart from one instance I'll leave you with, he was on the yacht of Aristotle and Onassis, the Greek squillionaire. This ludicrous, luxurious yacht. He was also there with Gracie Fields, the Rochdale songstress, the biggest actress of her day in the 1930s, and still very, very popular. Gracie Fields decided to sing Churchill a song, which kind of went, Winston Churchill, we love you, we love you, we love you, to the tune of Dean Martin's Valari, apparently. Winston Churchill turned to the person he was sitting next to and whispered, God's teeth, when is this going to end? And with that, you may be asking the same thing, so I shall end now. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Sinclair. Our next speaker is a distinguished writer and television director and a best-selling historian. Rick Stroud has written Kidnap in Crete, the true story of the abduction of a Nazi general, famously by Patrick Leigh Fermor. Lonely Courage, about the women of SOE. And his latest book is I'm Not Afraid of Looking into the Rifles, Women of the Resistance in World War I. Ladies and gentlemen, Rick Stroud.
Thank you very much. Just see what sort of time there is. When I arrived here today, I got even more confused than I normally am, because they had on the table this book, which is the last book I wrote, Lonely Courage, which is about women of the SOE, the Special Operations Executive. And the book I thought I was going to write about is this one, which is I'm Not Afraid of Looking into the Rifles. They're both about very, very brave women, and there is a sort of link to them, which is that this book is dedicated to my daughter Nell, who died of cancer. And she was a very, very, very brave woman, and she ran a circus. And I'm Not Afraid of Looking into the Rifles was sold to Simon & Schuster by a sad coincidence on her what would have been her 47th birthday. But by then she'd left us, and it's always meant rather a lot to me. And I've really enjoyed and found a lot of personal satisfaction trying to write about brave women. And it started when I was quite young, about 10, and I read in the Eagle comic about Violette Szabo. There was a sort of strip about her, and she was another very brave woman. And when I finished writing Lonely Courage, I thought, well, who can I write about now? And I had no idea. And then a friend of mine who was a journalist, she and I had done an event in Berlin. She sent me by complete chance a press cutting from a New York newspaper, from an American newspaper, about a woman called Gabrielle Petty. And I'd never heard of Gabrielle Petty. And Gabrielle was a woman who'd worked in the, who was Belgian. She was very young, and she'd had a very rough upbringing, but she became one of our most important agents there. And so I thought, well, I've never heard of her. I wonder who else there is. And I then went on and I found, well, one of the agents, not really an agent, but somebody who operated in Belgium at that time, was somebody you've probably all heard of, which is Edith Cavell. And there's that beautiful statue just off Trafalgar Square, which whenever I pass it, I'm impelled to go and touch it in memory of Edith. So I thought, well, maybe there's stuff here that will be a corollary to Lonely Courage. And I began to research it. And I found that there were more women who'd been completely forgotten, who had behaved with incredible courage and without even the training that the women in the SOE had had. These were just ordinary people. And as you know, there was the murder of the Prince Franz Josef in Sarajevo, which led, for reasons which I've never understood, to the First World War. It's very complicated, and I just can't work out how that happened. But that was the trigger for the First World War to begin. And the Germans said, right, we're frightened that this is a complete lie, by the way, we're frightened that the French are going to invade us, and so we are going to invade France to stop this happening, and we're going to cross Belgium. Will that be all right? And they said, no, it probably won't be all right. Please don't cross Belgium. And an American diplomat said, my God, he said, if they do that, he said, poor Belgium, they have no idea. The steamroller will just flatten them. And of course, that's exactly what happened. The steamroller of the German army, something like 400,000 well-armed, well-trained troops, facing the Belgian army, which was okay, but it wasn't up to that, and they behaved appallingly as they smashed their way through Belgium in order to get to France. They did all the stuff that we know about. You know, they burnt villages, they burnt towns, they burnt the library in Louvain, which is a medieval library. They did things that since then people said, well, that can't be true. It's just propaganda. But they did nail babies to walls and do the most ghastly things of the sort of which we are presently hearing about in Gaza. And the ordinary people of Belgium, particularly at this point, the people who were on what would become just behind the front line on the French and Belgian border, thought, well, what can we do? And the army went sweeping over them, and the British army tried to stop them and failed, and was pushed back to the Marne, where at last they were stopped, and that led to the trench system. But by this, which went right across France to the North Sea. But by this time, a lot of British and Allied soldiers had been marooned behind what had become the enemy lines, and they were sometimes armed, sometimes not armed. They weren't led, and they didn't know what to do. And a marvelous woman called the Princess Marie de Croix, that is not how you pronounce her name, but it's too complicated. I don't know how to pronounce her name. Decided that she would try and help, and she lived in a chateau, and the chateau had a secret room in it, and she began to sort of think, first of all, she thought, well, I'll set it up as a hospital maybe. At the same time, other people near her were finding these Allied soldiers who were now trying to eke out their livings in forests, and they began slowly to get them together and take them in groups to the princess's chateau, where she looked after them, and began to wonder what on earth they were going to do about them. In the meantime, two Allied soldiers had been taken who had been wounded, were taken to Brussels to Edith Cavell's hospital, which is a teaching hospital that she'd set up, which had set a new standard for nursing. And you must remember that at that time, nursing was not a very sort of glamorous or glorious profession, probably still isn't, but it was, in some areas, thought of as being just one step above being a prostitute. Anyway, Edith was a very, very seriously, deeply moral person, took these two people, and she found a way to get them to Holland. And that was the beginning of a route that took marooned Allied soldiers from the princess's chateau to Brussels and on. And it was a very, very dangerous thing. And the soldiers, Edith would say to the soldiers, please be careful, there are Germans everywhere. This is an occupied town. She sometimes found soldiers dancing in the streets singing British songs. And that was quite a difficult thing to deal with. And eventually, of course, it all went wrong. And another thing was that the Princess de Croix, when the Germans came to search her chateau, would put the soldiers into her secret room, which was in itself quite a tense thing. And once the Germans came, they searched the house, the soldiers were hidden, the soldiers eventually came out, and she says, see, look, I've saved your lives, but you won't give us women the vote, which I think was a very, very good point that she made. Anyway, eventually they were all arrested, and as you probably know, Edith was famously tried. The trial was a complete joke. It took place in German, which she couldn't speak. She could speak French. She was made to sign documents that she had no idea what she was signing, and she spent her last hours in a cell on her own reading the Imitations of Christ by St. Thomas à Kempis. And she said to the end of her days, and patriotism is not enough, and I must have no hatred or bitterness for anyone. And the next day, they took her out and shot her. And that was a propaganda sort of disaster for the Germans. Later on, Gabrielle Petit, who sort of takes over, had a very rough life. She became our most important agent in France and Belgium. And she, aged 23, was eventually captured. And this was a complete disaster. And she had a joke trial. And she was, at the sort of eve of her death, was asked, do you want a blindfold? And she said, I'm going to show you Germans that a Belgian woman knows how to die. I'm not afraid of looking into the rifles. And that gave me the title of the book. And she was shot the next day. She was buried in an unmarked grave. After the war, she was disinterred and had a state funeral. She is forgotten, and I hope that my book will bring her, to some extent, back to life. And God has sent me a very wonderful thing, because I wanted to go on writing about women like this. And I'd come across years ago one called Madeleine Riffaut in France, who was a French resistance worker. She, aged 19, had gone up to a German soldier on the bridge Pont Solferino in Paris and shot him in the head. She'd been captured, tortured, escaped. She then led this assault on the Hermann Goering redoubt in Paris as the Allies were entering the city. She became a radical journalist and a war correspondent. She worked in Algeria and Vietnam. She became Ho Chi Minh's honorary goddaughter. And I want to write, nobody's heard of her, I bet nobody in this room has heard of her. I want to write, I've now got the contract to write that book, and I hope that I can bring Madeleine along with these other women. And she's still alive, she's blind, she's paranoid, she's living in Paris, but she led an exemplary life. She always did what she thought was morally right, and the book is called Fighting in the Light, because that's what she said after she was released from her Gestapo prison. She said, it's such a wonderful thing to be fighting in the light at last, after being working in the occupied country. And I'm going to finish by reading actually a poem from Lonely Courage, which isn't actually about anything, any of them. It's an agent's cryptographical equipment. She used the poem to make code messages to send to England. But for me, it sort of sums up what these women were and what they sacrificed and what they did, and what I've tried to write about in my books. And that'll be the end of it when I say this. But the poem goes, the life that I have is all that I have, and the life that I have is yours. The love that I have of the life that I have is yours and yours and yours. A sleep I shall have, a rest I shall have, yet death will be but a pause. For the peace of my years in the long green grass will be yours and yours and yours. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Rick, for an extremely moving speech. Our last speaker is the distinguished historian Charles Spencer. Previous books include Blenheim, Battle for Europe, Killers of the King, To Catch a King, and The White Ship. This morning he delivered an extremely initially complimentary tweet about the Oldie lunch. He said, "It's always a fun occasion attended by people who seem to enjoy lunch and literature in equal measure." Very true. But then, Charles, I'm sorry, you made an outrageous suggestion. You said, "And they're not at all afraid of a pre-prandial drink or two, which makes for an easy-to-please audience." I'm afraid this is libelous, Charles, outrageous. We always have 3 pre-prandial drinks, or at least 6. But his latest book is a departure in his writing, an extremely moving, disturbing book about his time at prep school. It's called A Very Private School by Charles Spencer. Thanks so much.
Yes, I'm sorry about that. I have spoken for this audience several times over the last 20 years, but as Harry said, this is something completely different for me. And I was worried actually about 2 things when I tackled this story, and one was that it would seem incredibly self-indulgent. I mean, who could be interested in somebody else's school life? Probably not even your parents. And then at the same time, I was also worried about the sort of posh boy element of it, you know, to talk about tough times at one of the elite prep schools of Britain at the time. So it was all, I sort of tried to just deal with that. It's just fact. You know, we were very privileged. We did come from quite well-known families, most of us. It was a very small school. It's called Madewell Hall. It's still going, and it's actually a very good school now. That's not lawyers asking me to say that, but I have got friends with children there, and they seem to like it very much. But it was very different back when I was there. So I went there in 1972 after a rather idyllic childhood in North Norfolk. With my father and sisters, and went to a wonderful school in King's Lynn in Norfolk, which was run by the redoubtable and rather magnificent Miss Lowe, who just loved her children and made sure that we were very well looked after and learnt the true things of life, you know, good manners and thoughtfulness and a little bit of work on the side. But then I was taken, and I remember it quite eerily well, that on the 12th of September 1972, taken to boarding school. And I know there's a lot of people in this room who went to boarding school. But the extraordinary ritual of being packed off as an 8-year-old, or some were 7 when we started, to go and start a new life with strangers. It was utterly terrifying for all of us, I'm sure. I'd never spent a night away from home without a member of my family before. And there's this scene, which I still remember so well. My father, some of you remember, was a very sweet and lovely man and really didn't want to do this. It was just what people did. And I remember arriving in the hallway of Madewell, and there was this terrifying woman in charge. And she was called Mrs. Ford, and she was the matron. And my father went up to her and said, "Look, my son Charles has never stayed away. Could someone just keep an eye on him while he settles in?" And she thought this was hugely amusing because she didn't really care about how boys felt, etc. And so she summoned this boy over to me and said to my father, "This young man has been here for 4 years at the school and he'll look after Charles." And then I remember my father sort of kissing me on the head and rushing out the door to get away while I was distracted. And there was this extraordinary moment where I suddenly realized that this boy who was going to be looking after me probably wasn't as nice as I had hoped. And he just looked me up and down and he said, "You're on your own now." And actually, that was the only time he spoke to me, which was quite lucky because he turned out to be the school bully. So in a way, it was a good thing to get him out the way. But it was an introduction to an extraordinary place. I call it a very private school because that's how it thrived. The headmaster was a paedophile and a sadist, and he had constructed the perfect school for his purpose. He didn't allow the governors in. The parents were never allowed into the building except the first day when their boys started there. And he recruited the staff that he wanted. And there were only about 7 of them. 2 of the other masters were also sadists. And then the others tended to either be mute or enablers. And it's really a snapshot. What I wanted to do was write not a whinge, not an Angela's ashes for wealthy kids, but really have a look at the terrifying vulnerability of children at that time. And the privacy is really the point of the book. We had no access to a landline, and we had 1 letter home each week on a Sunday, which was read through by the master before it was allowed out. So there was no communication. And part of this story really is about parenting and what was accepted as normal then. Absolutely not normal now. I mean, we all do, you know, if you have children or grandchildren, you're very much expected to be part of the life of the school, but not then. You're absolutely discouraged from going there as a parent. I have one friend whose parents lived in Cornwall. This school's in Northamptonshire, and they only went to the school once on his first day in 5 years. And in fact, he was once told we had 2 exeats a term. The headmaster said, actually, extraordinarily, your parents are coming to take you out today. And then he was very excited, but it turned out that they'd sent the chauffeur instead, and he drove him from Northamptonshire to Leicester Square, sat with him to watch a movie, and then dropped him back. So it's a very bizarre way of looking at your role as a parent. My parents, I think, were totally oblivious. The headmaster was brilliant, as paedophiles tend to be, at presenting to the world in a certain way. And Christianity was his card, which he played very openly. A very perverted form of Christianity, though. When I was writing this book, I came across about 24 boys from the school who I had lost contact with. And one of them told me about how the headmaster's religion affected him. The headmaster was outraged, he told the boy, that his parents were getting divorced. And this little boy was struggling with that concept anyway. And so the headmaster said, so I think you should consider me as your father now. And the boy was taken down on Sunday evenings for what were called Sunday night confessions. And he had to strip and then tell the headmaster all the things he had done wrong that week. But he hadn't done anything wrong, so he had to invent little schoolboy crimes and then be beaten and worse. And it was extraordinary. He told me this in front of his mother, and she had no idea about this. She's 85, an absolutely lovely woman. And it's this extraordinary ability, really, of, I don't know, a system to take advantage of vulnerable children. It's not all bleak, the book. There are some high points in it. The director, HarperCollins, said, couldn't you put some jokes in it? And I said, well, maybe the next book. But this isn't a joke book, really. But it's a snapshot. It's a modern history. I tend to do Stuarts and medieval. But it was something quite extraordinary, really, to look at something that was part of my life 50 years ago and look at the effect of a very, very corrupt regime run by an incredibly clever abuser who charmed the parents. They would get a termly report, which was really amusing and very diverting and a very good smokescreen. So I've tried to peel back the smokescreen, look at this school, not because it's about my childhood, but because it was a system that was open to terrible abuse. And that's really why I tackled it. I've never thought, what's the next book? I never thought I've got to write this book. But things accumulated, and I just put on my computer a file called Madewell. And over time, I ended up with 700 paragraph headings involving boys' deaths because of the school, all the way through to what we had for tea on Tuesdays. And so I hope that anyone who reads it will think, first of all, thank God I didn't go to that school, but secondly, will learn something about children's vulnerability in very bad institutions. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Charles, and thanks so much to all three of our speakers, and thanks so much to all of you for coming here today. All three of our speakers will be just outside the front door, not with this door here, not where they were before lunch, literally outside this door to sign books. And I also have the winner of the Noble Caledonia raffle, and it's James Clapperson from Leeds. And you can collect your prize in the place where we were before lunch. But thank you all so much for coming, and thank you so much to our three speakers. Thank you.
You have been listening to the Oldie podcast. Please share this episode. Look out for the Oldie magazine subscription offer on our website www.theoldie.co.uk. Thank you and good luck.